The dollar's already had a long run as a reserve currency. I think that run is in its final stages. It's going to collapse, that's for sure. The question is how that collapse unfolds. All of our foreign creditors are going to repossess all the stuff that they sold us on credit that we can no longer afford. Imagine America without foreign products. Imagine going into a Walmart and the only stuff on the shelves is the stuff we made here. You don't stay in office by telling the voters the truth. You stay in office by telling them what they want to hear. And we've got a long way to go in consumer prices. They're going to double, they're going to triple, they're going to quadruple. People think that we have supply shortages now. They ain't seen nothing yet.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Very special guest on the channel today, the one and only Peter Schiff. Probably needs no introduction from my audience. He is the CEO and Chief Global Strategist of Euro Pacific Capital. I wanted to bring Peter on because he has a knack for explaining very complex macroeconomic topics to simpletons like myself. Now, Peter might not know this, but he is now going to be addressing probably what is the most bearish audience on the internet. So I'm hoping he can give us, don't hold back. We want the doomsday scenario. We want the worst case possible scenario because we want to be prepared for everything. We got our beans, bullets, band-aids, but I think some people might need to be pushed over the edge on this whole precious metal thing. So Peter, how you doing, man? And maybe if you can give us the skinny on, what are the prognostications for the market? I'm looking at Bitcoin right now. Bitcoin ain't doing too good today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nate. It sounds like you guys maybe could use a little ray of sunshine here rather than more gloom and doom. Yeah. Somebody's got to, look on the bright side of things. Yeah. But no, I think that there's a lot to be prepared for. Certainly, more so, I think, on our side of the border than up where you guys are. But yeah, Canada is not going to be, immune to what's going to happen. But I don't think that the problems there will be as bad as the U.S. But to the extent that some of your audience has bought into the whole Bitcoin as, hey, I'm preparing for a collapse of the dollar or the fiat monetary system, and in preparation for that, I'm going to buy Bitcoin as a hedge. I think that is a mistake. I think the people that took refuge in Bitcoin are going to discover that they jumped from the frying pan into the fire. So to the extent that you're, holding and hoping in Bitcoin, I would just fold. I wouldn't hold and hope. I would, make a more reasonable, analysis of the situation. Bitcoin was a bubble. The bubble likely reached its peak last year amid all sorts of hype at about 69,000, almost 70,000. We're now barely above 20,000. I think right now about 22,000, but it's still a long way down. So don't think it's cheap because it used to be 69,000. Think about how expensive it is because it used to be less than $1. In fact, it used to be less than a penny. So it's got a long way to fall. But gold and silver, which you mentioned, I think if you really want a safe haven from a meltdown in the fiat system, if you're looking for an inflation hedge, store of value alternative to fiat currency, if you want real money, then look no further than gold and silver. They've kind of been out of the spotlight, while Bitcoin's been around, kind of stealing some of their thunder. But that's going to pass. And I think as Bitcoin is exposed as fool's gold, I think a lot more people are going to buy the real thing. And so the prices are going to rise a lot in those metals. And so it's, you should be buying.
Yeah, well, my audience is a lot more steampunk than they are cyberpunk. So I think if anything, you're preaching to the choir with respect to gold and precious metals. But what do you think of this whole inflation situation? it's looking like, according to Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau, everything is just fine. And, we got the whole, what are they calling it, the anti-inflation bill, which is going to spend even more money to bring inflation down. I guess that's the recipe for success. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what we can expect with respect to inflation, and how do you think that there's a possibility for hyperinflation? Like, what I want to know, Peter, is how is the system going to collapse? Because we all know the game has to end at some point. The debt is not payable. We know that, there's going to be de-dollarization at some point. How does this whole house of cards collapse, in your opinion?
Well, it's going to collapse. That's for sure. So the question is, how that collapse unfolds. It's not quite as certain, because there are different ways that we can get to the end result. But we're going to be at that end result one way or another. And hyperinflation is certainly probably the worst way that this whole thing can end. And the probability of that is rising. I mean, it's not, a certainty by any means. But inflation is here to stay for a long, long time. I mean, we're not even close to the end of this. We're really at the beginning. Although the push towards inflation really started in earnest at the end of the 2008 financial crisis. That's what QE1 was. It was inflation. It was the government inflating the money supply to prop up financial assets, to bail out debtors. That's what happened with QE. I mean, quantitative easing, the mechanism is the Federal Reserve prints money and then uses that money to buy government bonds or buy mortgage-backed securities. That's inflation, right? Inflation is about expanding the money supply. That is literally the definition, at least it used to be, until the politicians changed it. You get an old Webster's dictionary, you can even find them online. Look at one even from the 1980s and look up inflation. And it says to expand, as in money supply. I mean, that's what it's about. Some of the definitions mention the effect of inflation, which is that after you expand the money supply, prices will go up. But prices don't inflate. Inflate means to expand. You don't expand a price. Prices go up, prices go down. It's money supply that gets expanded, and that's, inflation. And so we have been pursuing inflation as a policy goal for more than a decade. QE2, QE3, QE4. And in fact, if you look at the rhetoric of not only the Federal Reserve, but the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, what have all these central bankers been saying for years? We don't have enough inflation. We need more inflation. Inflation is too low. We are below our 2% target. And so they have been pouring gasoline on this fire. They have been deliberately creating inflation. And now we have to live with the consequences of over a decade of inflation, because now all that money printing is finally showing up in a very spectacular way in consumer prices. And it's just getting started, because initially, a lot of that inflation went into the financial markets, stock prices, real estate prices, bond prices. I mean, that's why stocks hit record highs. That's why real estate prices hit record highs. It wasn't that the fundamentals were getting better. It's just inflation. Cheap money was pushing up these valuations. But now all that cheap money has finally made its way to consumer goods. And that's where it's going to stay. Inflation always ends up in consumer goods. No matter how it starts, no matter how it enters the economy, it ends up in consumer prices. And we've got a long way to go in consumer prices. I mean, they're going to double, they're going to triple, they're going to quadruple. So, maybe we're up 20, 30% so far. This is early in the journey. And bills like the Inflation Reduction Act, they're just going to make it worse. Forget about what they're calling the bill. It's got nothing to do with inflation reduction. That's just so the politicians can brag about voting for it. But all the bill does is spend more money and make the economy even less efficient than it already is. So it's a recipe for even more inflation.
Yeah, I briefly looked at it, and I guess they're trying to bring the deficit down, but I still don't understand how hiring, 80,000 armed IRS agents is going to combat inflation, but I guess they're smarter than me. So this inflation thing, what's your prediction in terms of like an actual CPI? Like, do you think we'll go up above the 9.1% high that we just seen, or will that?
Yes.
Yeah, you think so?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure how many more months it will take before we get a year-over-year number that's higher than 9.1, but we're going to get it. And, eventually the government may make some more modifications to the CPI so that it won't be as big a number. Americans are going to feel the inflation, regardless of how the politicians want to lie about it by rigging the methodology for measuring it.
Yeah, there's a insidious nature to inflation because a lot of people think just like 10%, but like that's a compounding number too, right? So when I go to the grocery store, the price of food isn't just 10% what it used to be. It's actually a lot more, and then you factor in shrinkflation and all these things. So I think that it's a very deceiving number. I know that CPI used to be measured in a different way than it's measured now, but I've never been able to understand exactly what that's all about. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so in the early 1990s, the government decided to claim that the CPI was overstating inflation, and therefore they fixed it so that it would no longer overstate inflation. They didn't fix it, they rigged it. So now it understates inflation. And the initial goal was to reduce Social Security benefits because the Social Security COLAs, how much they have to increase Social Security every year, is tied to inflation. So it was kind of a backdoor way to cut Social Security, which the government needed to do. They were trying to reduce the deficits back then. But no politician wanted to vote to reduce Social Security. That's kind of political suicide. So they reduced it, kind of surreptitiously by rigging the CPI so that they could reduce the cost of living increases in Social Security and therefore cut Social Security without an official vote. But what they did is the CPI that we used to have was a fixed basket of goods. So the stuff in that basket never changed. And what the government said as well, that's not how people shop. If the price of beef goes up, well, they eat chicken instead. So the new basket is supposed to reflect the choices that we make. So if the price of beef goes up, well, let's not put that in the basket anymore. Let's take it out and let's put some chicken in. And so by manipulating the basket, it makes it appear that prices aren't going up, but they are going up because maybe I prefer to eat beef, but I can't afford it anymore. So now I'm stuck with chicken, right? Well, that doesn't mean there's no inflation. I mean, in theory, if food got so expensive, like chicken, or if I started buying dog food and then eating that, they would say, well, see, there's no inflation. Yeah, but I'm eating dog food. You're telling me there's no inflation? I can't afford chicken anymore. I can't afford meat. All I can afford is Alpo. And you're telling me there's no inflation because I'm paying for Alpo what I used to pay for filet mignon, right? So that's part of it. But also they have something now called hedonics, which they didn't have back then. See, the government says, hey, prices are going up, but the quality is being improved. So you're not really paying more. If the price goes up by 10%, but it's 15% better, well, the price actually went down by 5%. Except that's all subjective. How do you know that the quality is 15% better? And even if it's better, does it really benefit me? Maybe it's got some things I don't even want, but I'm stuck paying for it anyway. And the price has gone up. And of course, there are a lot of times where quality goes down and the government doesn't pick that up. The government doesn't even calculate that. It seems like they think everything gets better and nothing gets worse. But I know from experience, a lot of quality has come down as a result of price pressure. So in order to stop from raising prices, they use cheaper materials, cheaper ingredients. I remember at one point, whenever I bought something, I used to buy it fully assembled. That's when it was made in America. You'd just go to the store and you'd buy something. Well, now you buy it from China and it comes in a huge box with hundreds of pieces and an instruction manual you could barely read. and you got to spend hours trying to put the damn thing together. How much is your time worth, right? Yeah. I mean, so there's all sorts of ways that quality goes down that doesn't get measured. I mean, look at air travel, right? Oh, they're saying, oh, the price of air travel is only up by a certain amount. Yeah, but when I used to buy a ticket, it came with a meal. I didn't have to pay extra to check my luggage. They included a blanket and a pillow. I mean, you look at all the services that they took away instead of raising prices. None of that really gets captured in the CPI. So the whole thing is rigged. It's manipulated deliberately because the government wants the number to be low. I mean, obviously, the lower they can pretend inflation is, the better they can pretend the economy is. In fact, we deflate GDP by what they claim inflation is. So it's kind of like asking the mafia to do a report on crime, because if there's more crime, we want to hire more cops. Well, if the mafia is in charge of reporting on crime, what are they going to say? Hey, there's no crime. In fact, we don't even need the cops we have. We have so little crime. Why don't we fire a few policemen? Because we clearly don't need them, right? You're not going to get an honest report on the crime rate from the criminals. And, the government is not going to give you an honest report on the inflation that it is creating, because all inflation comes from government, comes from central banks. The government doesn't come from the private sector, doesn't come from economic growth, doesn't come from greedy businesses gouging their customers. It doesn't even come from Putin.
Yeah, and that's the scary thing with all this is that, there's still a lot of people who are putting their faith in the government's numbers. And I mean, if last year wasn't enough proof for people that you should not put really any stock in what the Fed, whoever is the Powell or whatever his name is, when he said that inflation was going to be minimal and it was going to be transitory, and we're seeing the complete opposite of that. I mean, that's just one instance of the government lying, but it seems like no matter how much they lie, they're always viewed as the de facto authority over, the future. But aside from some slight gains in technological deflation that we're seeing, as a result of new innovations, the price of everything else is going up. Everybody's living paycheck to paycheck, and everything is just insanely expensive, like way more than the CPI reflects, in my personal opinion. That's just based on my own.
Well, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, that is the case. When you look at some of the raw numbers, like the import-export prices, where you see year-over-year increases of like 18%, those are more honest numbers than is the CPI. But, the Fed, they're either wrong about everything or they lie about everything. But, either way, it's pretty bad. First they told us that we didn't have enough inflation. We needed more. And then when we got more, they were like, okay, this is good because we finally got more inflation. And then when we got more than they bargained for, they said, well, don't worry about it. It's all transitory. And then they had to admit that it wasn't transitory. But by then, it was, 7-8% by the time they finally said, okay, I guess it's not transitory. Maybe we should stop pouring gasoline on the fire, because up until the point that they admitted it wasn't transitory, they were still doing quantitative easing. They still had interest rates at zero, even though we clearly had an inflation problem. But of course, then they said we could fight inflation without hurting the economy, because we've got this super strong economy that's going to be impervious to rate hikes. But then they put the economy in recession. We've been in a recession in the US all of 2022. But their response to that is to change the definition of recession so they can pretend that we don't have one.
Right.
Even though we're clearly in one, and it's going to get much worse as the Fed continues to hike rates, which is why at some point it's going to reverse the process and go back to cutting rates. They're going to go back to quantitative easing, because the recession is going to become a depression. And we're also going to have a financial crisis that's worse than 2008. Because the entire phony economy is built on a foundation of inflation. And you can't start chipping away at that foundation without that whole house of cards tumbling down, which is why I think they're going to stop. But right now they're pretending that it's full speed ahead, that they are committed to fighting inflation no matter the cost, and I don't believe them.
Yeah, it's unsettling to know that, no matter how bad things get, they'll keep kind of moving the goalposts and changing the definitions. And I think that's why people in this community are so skeptical of what the government's analysis is of this, and more so skeptical of where we're going in the future, which is why they're seeking out alternative viewpoints, because the historical track record of truth is not very good for a lot of these major institutions. So
not governments are notorious liars, because in democracies, and unfortunately that's what we are. I mean, we're supposed to be a republic, but we've kind of lost the character of that republic in the United States over the years. But when you elect people, the biggest liar wins. That's what elections are about. People lie to get elected. And so the best liar wins. And the ones that can lie consistently win the most. They stay in office. You don't stay in office by telling the voters the truth. You stay in office by telling them what they want to hear. But you also have to do a lot of bad things to get the money to stay in office so you can afford the advertisement and all that. And so you got to lie about too. So you have to be very conniving. You can't have any principles or any character. You have to be kind of a real lowlife to succeed in politics in a democracy. So that's what we've got. We've got the biggest liars who have the most power.
Yeah. And we all kind of know how that ultimately is going to end. It's not going to end well, unfortunately. Do you foresee de-dollarization actually gaining steam, or do you think that the US dollar still has a long run as the global reserve currency? How do you figure all of this tension with China and Russia is going to factor into the potential de-dollarization and just the collapse of the US dollar as the global reserve currency? Like, what's that going to look like when it happens?
Yeah, well, first of all, the dollar's already had a long run as a reserve currency. So I think that run is in its final stages. Now, how much longer, it can limp around before collapsing. I mean, we've had a rally in the dollar recently. I mean, it's not a spectacular rally, but, the dollar index even today is up around 108, which is relatively high. The euro is getting close to parity again against the dollar. We've had a pretty big drop in the Japanese yen relative to the dollar. But it's not, the type of spectacular rally that I think we've had in the past when people have, fled to the dollar. I think the geopolitical stuff is not going to be the reason for the dollar's demise. I think there are bigger issues that are going to be weighing more heavily on the dollar that are just financially, our own deficits and money printing and all that. But obviously, what's happening now just accelerates the process and shines an even brighter spotlight on why countries should move away from the dollar. I mean, look at how we punished Russia. Russia did something that we didn't like. Now, whether or not, what they did is wrong or right is irrelevant. If you're somebody like China and you're looking at, hey, Russia did something that America didn't like, and America was able to punish them with these sanctions. Well, what if we do something that America doesn't like? Do we want to be in a position where we can get punished? Of course not. Nobody wants to hand that kind of a weapon to their enemy if we're their enemy, although, China is our biggest banker and our biggest supplier. So, it's interesting that we're, biting the hand that feeds us. Maybe we don't realize that they're feeding us, but we should, because Americans get lots of valuable products from China, and all China gets from us is dollars, which really are worthless. We just create them out of thin air. So we've got the better end of the bargain, getting real goods, and they get stuck with worthless IOUs. So to the extent that they wise up and stop doing that, they're the winners. The U.S. will be the loser. But I think what's happening now, and the reason that we have any rally in the dollar, is because the world, for whatever reason, still has confidence in the Federal Reserve. I don't know why. I mean, they've gotten everything wrong, but the world still believes them. Now, maybe, that's just part of the insanity. Maybe they think, okay, well, maybe this time they'll finally get it right. But the Fed is pretending that they're committed to fighting inflation, and the markets, I guess, are pretending to believe them. Look at the yield on a 30-year Treasury is only about 3%. I mean, that shows that bond investors think the Fed is going to succeed in putting this inflation genie back in the bottle. That's why gold is around $17.50. The market has confidence that the Fed is going to, get rid of inflation. But the reality is it's impossible. They're not going to do it. Interest rates of 3 or 4% are not going to cut it. They need much higher than that. Rates have to be higher than the rate of inflation. But the markets, the economy can't afford those rates because there's so much debt. So there is no way to bring inflation back down to 2% without a massive financial crisis, a wave of defaults and foreclosures and bankruptcies and crashing asset prices. And the government is going to have to slash government spending and maybe even default on its obligations, including U.S. Treasury. So I just don't think the Federal Reserve has the stomach to actually do what it takes. Now, they can pretend they have the stomach, but when they actually have to do something and make that choice, I don't think they're going to choose to fight inflation. I think they're going to choose to prop up the U.S. government, prop up the financial markets, and then the dollar will implode, because then markets will figure out what should already be obvious, which is that inflation is going to be here forever, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and the dollar is going to be a bottomless pit, that its purchasing power is going to implode, and people need to get out, and they need to find an alternative quickly to the dollar as a medium of exchange or unit of account for global payments.
Do you think it's maybe because there's a lack of better options out there, like compared to the dollar, that it kind of people have been trained to gravitate towards the dollar in times of crisis, which is why anytime there's a global crisis, like during the pandemic, the dollar was strengthened compared to other currencies. Is it just because there's not a viable alternative? And if so, what do you think could dethrone the dollar as the global reserve currency? Like, what will people flock to? I mean, I read a report yesterday that China is starting to ramp up its gold imports, as well as some other countries. So do you think it's going to be the yuan? Is it going to be a BRICS?
Well, here's the problem. I mean, it's a beauty contest, but all the contestants are pretty ugly, right? So it's difficult because, okay, let's get rid of the dollar. Well, what are we going to use? Are we going to use the euro? We use the yen? I mean, the Chinese RMB? I mean, no other currency really stands out as, this is going to be great. And so, it's the devil which is the dollar, versus the ones maybe we don't. What would happen if, we anointed the euro with that crown? But I think there's an obvious contestant that is not ugly at all, that is actually quite beautiful, and that's gold, right? There's nothing more beautiful than gold. And gold is real money. People forget that before the dollar was the international reserve, gold was the international reserve, and all the currencies were pegged to gold, not the dollar. And when the world went from gold to the dollar, it was because the dollar was fixed in a specific weight of gold. It was $35, or Federal Reserve notes got you an ounce of gold. That was the deal. And the U.S. had that gold stored up at Fort Knox. And if somebody in Germany or somebody in France or someone in Japan wanted their gold, all they had to do was take the $35 over to the Federal Reserve, and they said, here's your gold, here's your ounce of gold, right? We got it for you. So not only was the dollar backed by gold, it was redeemable on demand in gold. So in a way, gold was still the reserve. It was just through the dollar that gold acted as the reserve. Now in 1971, which, about 51 years ago this week is when we went off that standard, that all changed. And so then the dollar went from being the reserve without any ties to real money. So what I think the world needs to do is just go back to the real money that used to anchor the monetary system before the U.S. got everybody to go off on that tangent. And then, no one country enjoys this exorbitant privilege of being able to create the reserve out of thin air. Everybody has to work to earn gold, and it levels the playing field.
It appears
and that gold is an asset. It's not also somebody else's liability. So it works much better as money, and will have a much better monetary system if it's based on gold than some fiat currency.
Would you say that the US dollar disproportionately benefits US citizens, or is it actually, because obviously the Chinese have a vested interest in the system as it is, because for whatever reason it's working to generate wealth elsewhere. When the dollar collapses, won't that affect other countries as much as it does the US, or will it affect the US more?
Well, it will affect everybody. And actually, some countries, they will be affected in a positive way. The US, it will definitely be a negative way. But there's always winners and losers in any status quo. And so, yes, if the dollar collapses, there will be some losers in China. But, the winners will far outnumber the losers. So I think it'll be a net benefit for China. It will be a massive net negative for America. Now, over a very long-term period of time, it probably is going to be a positive. But Americans, as our economy has been disintegrating, we have enjoyed a big subsidy from China and the rest of the world. And without that subsidy, our standard of living would be much lower. But of course, since that subsidy is going to come to an end eventually anyway, we've actually gotten a lot poorer, even though we don't realize it. So we simply set ourselves up for a bigger fall once the Chinese and other countries, come to their senses. But the way we've been benefiting from that is go into a store, go into a Walmart, or just go online and look at all the products on Amazon and take a look at where they're made. It's very difficult to find anything that was made in America. It's kind of like going on a scavenger hunt. And most of the stuff that is made in America isn't really made here. It's just assembled here. All the parts are made in other countries. And in fact, in many cases, that's the same thing with our military, right? We have to import all the stuff that goes into our planes, or in our Jeeps or whatever we're assembling here, but we're completely dependent on these foreign products. Now, where do these products come from? I mean, the Chinese just don't wave a wand and poof, all this stuff just comes into existence. No, they had to make it. How do you make it? Well, you need capital. How do you get capital? Well, you have to save your money. You have to not consume. You have to invest. You have to build all this stuff. You need to devote land to it. You need to devote labor. You need to train all these workers. They have to show up and they have to help make this stuff. And then you got to deal with the pollution, that comes from all these factories, right? And all this stuff. So America, we don't have to do any of that. We outsourced all that. We said, hey, China, you invest the money, you sacrifice, you consume, you build up factories, you take the pollution, you get your workers to do all the hard labor. We're just going to print money. In fact, we're not even going to print it. We're just going to create it on a computer and just into existence. And we're just going to kick back and we're just going to perform services on one another. We're going to have a service sector economy. We don't want to get our hands dirty. We don't want to create pollution. And we're just going to spend everything. We don't want to have to save so that we can make investments. We're just going to spend. And in fact, you're going to loan us the money. We're going to go into debt and you're going to loan us the money because you're going to take all the money that you earn producing all this stuff and you're just going to loan it right back to us by buying our bonds. So meanwhile, Americans, we're going to live this great life. We're going to have all this stuff. And you Chinese, well, you're going to have to do without all this stuff. You're going to have to live a more frugal lifestyle in order so Americans can have this extravagant lifestyle. See, that's kind of the deal that we have. And that's what's going to end. Imagine America without foreign products. Imagine going into a Walmart and the only stuff on the shelves is the stuff we made here.
It's going to be a rude awakening when people realize how deindustrialized we've become when we are fully decoupled, if there is some abrupt decoupling that happens as a result of a war and the cargo ships just stop coming over.
I'm talking about just a dollar collapse. See, if the dollar crashes, we can't import anything because we can't afford it. Because the dollars aren't, our trading partners aren't going to accept those dollars, or that we would need to pay so many of them. So that, I think it's going to be a currency crisis that brings it all about. And if people think that we have supply shortages now, they ain't seen nothing yet in America. I mean, wait till they see how much bigger these shortages get when the imports stop completely because we can't afford them anymore. But also, when the dollar crashes, our exports from America are going to pick up. But since we don't export a lot of manufactured stuff, what we're going to export is stuff that we imported in the past. Think about cars. Yeah, we make some cars here, but we have a lot of cars on the road that we imported from Japan, from Europe. When the dollar crashes, all those used cars are going to get real cheap for people outside the United States. And they're going to be willing to pay prices that Americans can't afford. So what are we going to export? Used stuff. In a way, it's kind of like a repossession. All of our foreign creditors are going to repossess all the stuff that they sold us on credit that we can no longer afford.
Wow. And so, I mean, as this is playing out, you're talking about a significant downgrade in the standard of living, which is all the more reason, I guess, for people to try to hedge against this. So you're saying that one of the best ways to hedge against the inevitable collapse whenever it comes is gold. I've heard you say before, too, at one of your recent interviews, you encourage people to buy things that they're going to use regularly. And I thought that was a great suggestion, like buy things that you know are going to be more expensive next year but aren't going to necessarily degrade in value. Things like certain foodstuffs, different commodities like toiletries or whatever the case is, right? So I think that was good advice.
Yeah, of course. I mean, all the preppers, any prepper knows that, right? But look, why save your money to buy stuff? Let's say I have, I want to buy some toothpaste or some deodorant or some razor blades. Why just buy what I need to get by for the week or the month and then have savings? If my savings are earning 1 or 2% interest, right? But the cost of razor blades can go up 20% between now and next year. I mean, what's the point? Why not just buy the razor blades that I need next year right now? That's like a 20% return on my investment. And of course, razor blades can go up even more than that. The only way I would lose money is if razor blades got cheaper. But I mean, the odds of that are pretty slim. I'd rather bet that they're going to get more expensive. And in fact, not only might they get more expensive, what if they're in short supply? What if the government says, these companies are gouging people with these expensive razor blades. Let's have price controls. Let's limit how much you can charge for these things. Well, then what happens? Then they're not even there. Then I have to go to the store and wait on a long line to get some razor blades. I'd rather buy them now when I don't have to wait online. And that could apply for a whole bunch of products that are just going to keep. So you might as well buy them. And what you may even be able to do with your razor blades in the future is, let's say somebody else needs some razor blades and they don't want to wait for a few hours. Maybe you could trade them, right? You could use them as a barter. Hey, I'll give you some razor blades. You can give me something else. It could be used as a medium of exchange. So there's a lot of reasons to do that. But, that's only going to work for so much money. I mean, maybe you have an extra couple of $1,000. Yeah, you could stock up on toiletries and some food. But if you got $100,000, if you got $1 million, you're not going to buy $1 million worth of razor blades. So you have to have other ways of storing your wealth. That's what I'm helping people do at my asset management company, Europe Pacific Asset Management, is invest around the world in assets that will do well during this type of inflation, during a time period where the dollar is dethroned as the reserve currency and you have a major upheaval in the global financial markets. There'll be winners and there's losers. Like I said, I want to be a winner. Now, I'm not going to be a winner as an American. As an American, I'm a loser, right? But I could be a winner as an investor. Just because I live in America doesn't mean I have to just invest in America. I can invest in the countries that are going to come out on top, that are going to benefit from all this. And I can invest in the type of companies that will benefit from this. Companies that have the right customers, that have the right currencies, companies that are selling the right products that those wealthier customers will be consuming. And I could buy other things like gold and silver. And in fact, even better, the mining stocks. If I'm right about what's going to happen to gold and silver, you'll make a lot more money owning the companies that have the gold and silver in the ground and that are able to mine it and make a profit. I think the gains there could be spectacular. So, that's what your wealthier audience should be doing, is not just preparing, their homes, but preparing their portfolios. And that's where I come in. And in fact, we're also registered up in Canada as a registered investment advisor. A lot of times Canadians have a hard time working with US advisors because of these licensing issues, but we went and got licensed in Canada, specifically so we can help Canadians, even with your retirement accounts. You can invest with us in those, and we can manage money for you and build portfolios for you that I think will not only help you survive, but thrive in the environment that lies ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as preppers, we tend to advise people to, make sure you have all your bases covered first, all the basic provisions. There's a lot of big ticket prepping items that have like a regenerative capability, things like solar, off-grid power systems, investments like that might tie up some of your larger disposable income. But like you're saying, if you have 100,000 in the bank, that's a little bit too much food perhaps. So what do you think about real estate moving forward, buying land, as a hedge?
Yeah, well, real estate is a very broad, category of property. And so I think there is some real estate that will do very well. Farmland will probably be, in heavy demand,
That's why Bill Gates is mine.
But, an office building in a major city, a mall, one of these big mega malls, those are going to have a big problem. But also residential real estate. Again, it depends on where that residential real estate happens to be, and what the current prices are. I mean, if you have these sky high residential prices that far outstrip the ability to pay, and they've been propped up by cheap money, and a lot of people who have benefited from that cheap money, you could see big crashes in those property markets. But other property markets could hold up better, But I think overall, real estate in the U.S. on a relative basis will lose considerable value relative to real estate, let's say in emerging markets. So if you have a choice, hey, I can buy some real estate in some emerging market versus the U.S. I mean, in general, it's going to be the emerging market real estate, which is going to throw off a much, much better return. Yeah,
one of my issues with gold, and I mean, I do have a bit of precious metals, been getting a little bit more into it lately, but one of my concerns, and I think for preppers, it's always a security issue, and how much gold does a person want to have, on their, not on their person, but at their home or in a bank vault. Do you want it in a bank vault? Do you want paper gold? Do you want, gold stocks like you're saying? Well, what if there's some sort of collapse of the dollar? How does that affect the stock market? So what is your recommendation for, gold? Like, would you recommend that people actually hold a certain amount of physical gold? Or would you entrust that to a bank? Or would you just maybe put 90% in gold stocks? Like, what would your spread look like?
Well, a lot of it depends on how much gold you can afford to buy. So if somebody can afford $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 worth of gold, yeah, you should just take possession of that gold yourself. It doesn't take up a lot of space, and so you can hide it pretty easily and keep it safe. Nobody will know that you own it. But, if you're talking about significant amounts of money, millions of dollars, a lot of people may not feel comfortable keeping that much gold at home. And by the way, to buy physical gold and silver, Schiff Gold, that's the company I recommend. I founded that company and I'm still involved in the company. I'm not the owner, but I work closely with them to make sure they adhere to the principles that I always had when I did own it, which is not to rip off the customers, no numismatics, no excessive markups. We're just getting you as much gold as you can and silver for the lowest possible cost above the melt value of the coins, which is really what you want. You don't want to be a coin collector. You want to own precious metals. Collecting coins is like collecting baseball cards. I mean, you can do that if you want, and sometimes there's a market for those. But most people who are buying gold are not trying to be coin collectors. They just want to hedge against inflation. They want to store value, and you don't get that, in a collectible. Because the collectible market is very different. There are a lot of other factors, and the markups are notoriously high. I'd rather pay a 2% markup than a 40% markup. It's hard to make money when you overpaid for something by 40%. So Schiff Gold is where you want to go. But we could also arrange for you to have your metals stored in places like Switzerland, Singapore, other locations where I would more trust the government not to steal your money. I would be very leery of keeping my gold in an American bank, in a safety deposit box. I just get very nervous because I don't trust the U.S. government at all for good reasons. So, and the same thing with a lot of these ETFs or things like that. I don't think that's the best place to keep your physical gold. Now, as far as gold stocks are concerned, it would be very difficult for the government to come and seize the ownership of a gold stock. Because if they can seize your gold stocks, they can seize all stocks. And I don't see them doing that. And in fact, I don't think they could say, hey, we're just going to take your gold stocks and we're not going to take anybody else's tech stocks. I mean, if they're going to take stocks, they're taking everybody's stocks. And I don't know that we're going to be able to do that. And why should they? The government doesn't have to take anything. It just prints. It takes everything by printing. And so why steal what you can print, right? They can steal your purchasing power and it's legal. At least we think it's legal. They just keep printing money. They can start running trillion-dollar bills off the presses. What does that do to your hundreds if the government starts spending trillions, right? So I don't think they're going to seize your stocks. And so I think that, if you want to have a lot of leverage, I think having a good portfolio of these stocks, and we have managed accounts at Europe Pacific Asset Management where we have portfolios that are all gold and silver mining stocks. But even the ones that are not focused on gold and silver mining, even like my value strategy, still includes a allocation to that sector.
Yeah, it's, I know historically the U.S. government has seized gold, haven't they, from people who had it?
Well, they did it once, but they didn't seize it in that, they didn't send government agents, to people's houses and just
like
shake them down.
Armed IRS agents?
Yeah. They just relied on people to come and turn in their gold, right? Okay, bring your gold into the government, and that they do that sometimes with handguns. If someone says, okay, turn in your guns, some people turn in their guns and get cash. A lot of people say, no, I'm keeping my gun, and they keep it. They don't send agents out there. So that's what happened in 1933. But then until the early 1970s, it was illegal to own gold. I mean, you can own it, in a non-monetary form, right? I mean, you can have gold fillings, you can have a gold watch, you could have your silverware plated in gold, but you couldn't have a gold bar, couldn't have a gold coin. And so, but that changed. But people weren't going to jail for owning gold. And again, when the government seized gold or made it illegal, we were still on a gold standard, and that was a big reason for it. But now that we're off the gold standard, if the government seizes gold, that's just like seizing real estate. That's like seizing stocks. I mean, we pretty much have to go communist to do that. Now, maybe we will. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not a possibility. But if the government starts seizing gold, you better start worrying about everything you own, because they're not going to stop at your gold. They're going to take it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and we were talking about, Switzerland and Austria as being neutral countries and, as safe havens for storing assets in the case of a big war flaring up or something like that. But I could foresee also, people having legitimate concerns about, personal security. If the dollar does do what you're suggesting, then that's going to lead to a marked reduction in the socioeconomic quality of life, which of course accompanies with it a lot of crime. And so you're going to have a situation where, the haves and the have-nots is divided by people with guns who are protecting their gold, and people who, perhaps don't have a lot of anything anymore because they lose it all. So we're entering it starts to paint a pretty grim picture if we're going back to that gold standard. Like, is there a better way that it can emerge? Like, I've heard you talk about a cryptocurrency pegged to gold. Is there a more practical solution to go back to a gold standard?
Well, first of all, the environment that may lead us to a gold standard, yes, I agree, is going to be quite bad. But embracing the gold standard is going to be one of the first steps in turning everything around. I mean, that's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, when we're finally forced to do the right thing, because doing the wrong thing for so many years has finally blown up in a big way. But that's one of the reasons that I'm bearish on real estate in cities, is because the crime is just going to get so much worse. In fact, it's already bad. A lot of the people who are leaving the big cities, it's not just high taxes, it's an increase in crime. And I think crime is really going to increase if we have a dollar crisis, because you're going to have food shortages, you're going to have power blackouts, and you're going to have an absence of police. I mean, I think the police are not going to show up for work if their paychecks don't have any value. They're going to be more concerned about protecting their own families than protecting yours. So it's kind of going to be every man for himself. And it's going to be difficult. And, you've seen how, people become lawless, just if the power goes out, for one, day there's a blackout, or hell, sometimes people start looting just because their team wins the Super Bowl. I mean, you talk about a real reason to go out on a crime spree. You talk about, the welfare checks and the food stamps having no value. You're talking about no food on the shelves. People are hungry and they're cold or they're hot, depending on the time of year. You don't think they're going to steal under those circumstances? Of course. So, you may be a prepper and you may have a lot of stuff, but if you're too close to, people that don't have a lot of stuff, they may come for your stuff, right? Now, of course, you can defend yourself, which is why the preppers should also have a lot of ammo. to defend what they've got. But at least if you put some distance, if you're far away from those cities, they may not venture out that far, especially if they can't afford gas. They won't be able to drive out and find you.
Yeah, strategic relocation and location is a big part of preparedness for sure. And I've always thought those like Black Friday specials, it doesn't happen so much anymore, but I always thought that was like a trial run for, what could potentially come when the cargo ships stop coming over from China.
Yeah, America, I mean, I'm not sure, what it's like up in Canada, but I know that the Americans that we have now, I mean, this is not the Americans that we had during the Great Depression. I mean, people were embarrassed when Roosevelt first introduced relief. People were embarrassed to take it. And a lot of people actually paid the money back. They felt so badly about taking money from the government that they actually returned it right after they didn't need it anymore. I mean, we don't have that kind of character anymore. Everybody believes they're entitled to something for nothing. And the minute what they think they're entitled to is no longer there, this is a whole different ball game. I mean, the Americans today, we couldn't have survived the Great Depression. And again, not that the Great Depression was some byproduct of capitalism. The government caused that economic crisis, not the free market. But at least we had a civil society that was able to get through it. We don't have that civility anymore.
Yeah, and another thing with that is that during the Great Depression, people were more rural, so they had more skill sets that could kind of carry them through an austere time like that, which people just don't have anymore.
That's a trade-off. I mean, yes, we're more prosperous because we don't have to do it all ourselves, but we become more dependent on other people. And if that whole thing breaks down, no, you can't fend for yourself. You can't feed yourself, right? Like Americans could in the 1930s.
And I think the extent of our survival skills now are how quickly you can open an Amazon box, if it even gets to you.
Yeah, well, and there'll be nothing in the box.
Yeah, exactly.
We now have a record number of Americans who are holding down 2 full-time jobs simultaneously. If we really had a strong labor market, which is what the politicians claim, why would you need 2 or 3 jobs? You were stuck with that crappy job. And the only way you can get by is to get another crappy job. And that's what's happening. The government is creating the crises. You know, it's like they light a fire and they say, okay, see, now we'll put it out. We'll protect you from this fire that we lit.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.